Impossible, Captain Darius Vex muttered, eyes locked on the shifting data streams cascading across the laser plasma display. From the command platform of the Vindicator, his personal warship, the planetary scans painted a picture that could not exist. "Run it again," he ordered, his voice edged with a tension that crept through the command deck like static before a storm. His crew did not hesitate. Orbital relays recalibrated, spectrometric arrays realigned, and the ship's gravity-anchored scanners pulsed across the planet's surface in precise, sweeping waves. Yet the data did not change. The planet below, categorized in the Union's archives as uninhabitable, displayed structured energy patterns, atmospheric stabilizers, and functional power grids. "Captain," Navigation Officer Ricks ventured, his scaled fingers hovering above the hollow interface, "these readings indicate artificial structures across multiple quadrants. Artificial. Constructed. As if someone had claimed this hellhole and called it home." Vex exhaled slowly. He had spent decades enforcing Union control, charting lawless sectors, shutting down unauthorized expansions. But this was something different. "The oceans have biological indicators far beyond standard predation," Science Chief Sellex noted, adjusting the data overlay to display the swirling thermal patterns beneath the planetary waters. "Something inside the tides is actively hunting, not aimless feeding patterns, structured movements, coordinated strikes." "And the land?" Vex asked, already dreading the answer. Sellex's violet eyes flickered. "Large-scale carnivores, apex hunters operating in controlled zones. Something is managing their movements, containing them in designated territories." Silence coiled around the bridge. Who in the void could manage that? Tactical Officer Valen scoffed. "That's not survival. That's control." Then the scanners pulsed again, displaying something even worse. An orbital defense grid. Heat signatures bloomed across titanium-class plating, sleek stations nestled into strategic geosynchronous orbit and, most damning of all, targeting arrays rotating toward the Union fleet. Vex's fingers curled into a fist. This planet was supposed to be a graveyard. Instead, it was a fortress. "Open a direct line," he commanded. No distress signals had come from the surface, no desperate pleas for evacuation. If there were survivors, they were either unaware of their situation or too confident to care. The moment the signal connected, the response came without hesitation. "You are entering restricted airspace. Identify your fleet or disengage immediately." The voice on the other end was calm, collected, unmoved. The command deck fell still. Vex's crew exchanged uneasy glances. This was not the tone of a dying colony begging for rescue. "This is Captain Darius Vex of the Galactic Union Exploration Fleet," he replied, measuring his words carefully. "We received no prior notice of a Union-sanctioned settlement in this sector. Identify yourselves." A brief pause. Then, in that same measured cadence, the transmission resumed. "Commander Nathaniel Cade, Sovereign Authority of Outpost Epsilon 17. Sovereign. Not settlement. Not expedition. Sovereign Authority. Vex's chest tightened. "Our records indicate this planet was designated uninhabitable by the Union's colonial surveyors," he pressed. "How long has your presence been established here?" Another pause. Then, "Long enough." The finality in the response sent a ripple of unease through the bridge. Before Vex could reply, the transmission flickered, and Cade's face materialized on the command display. Dark-haired, cold-eyed, and entirely unimpressed, Commander Cade regarded them with the distant scrutiny of a predator assessing unfamiliar prey. The uniform he wore was stripped of all insignia, nothing but reinforced combat material, functional, efficient, war-ready. Behind him, the display revealed glimpses of the colony, a stark contrast against the hostile terrain. Steel-plated barricades interwoven with bioorganic structures, automated turrets seamlessly fused into the environment, and what appeared to be massive predatory creatures patrolling the perimeter. Vex masked his unease. "Commander Cade, this is classified as Galactic Union space?" "No," Cade interrupted smoothly. It isn't. Vex stiffened. This planet, Cade continued, was abandoned by the Union. You dismissed it, wrote it off. We didn't. We claimed it. A claim. A direct challenge. The tension on the bridge became suffocating. Cade tilted his head slightly, eyes sharp. You're here because you don't understand what you're looking at. I'll give you this chance once. Disengage and leave, or come down and see for yourself. The transmission cut abruptly. For several beats, no one spoke. Then Valen exhaled through gritted teeth. Captain, we cannot allow... I know, Vex murmured. A decision had already formed. Prepare the diplomatic escort, he ordered. We're going down. The descent felt wrong. Vex sat rigid inside the drop vessel, flanked by Ambassador Orlan Trix and a half-dozen Union escorts, each outfitted in full protective gear. Through the reinforced viewing panels, the landscape below unfolded like a battlefield, waiting to be claimed. A mixture of razor-edged mountains, expanses of shifting sands, and dense forests whose canopies pulsed with unnatural bioluminescence. Nothing should thrive here. Yet Outpost Epsilon 17 stood unshaken. Upon landing, the airlock hissed, and the first wave of sensory assault struck, heat pressing like a vice, the stench of volatile minerals, and a low, undulating rumble from distant, unseen creatures. Vex's eyes swept the fortified perimeter. Heavy-gauge plating reinforced with native materials, kinetic shielding humming with contained energy, and the unmistakable presence of towering reptilian beasts stationed at the entrance, wearing some kind of harnessed gear. Ambassador Trix swallowed audibly. They've trained the predators. Before Vex could respond, the compound's outer doors slid open. Cade emerged, unarmed, unshaken, unafraid. Vex stepped forward, meeting the human's steady gaze. Cade's eyes flickered between the Union delegation, then his expression shifted into something almost amused. You're not here to save us, he said. You're here to understand why you can't control us. Trix cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of authority. Commander Cade, the Galactic Union has strict protocols regarding unauthorized... You're wasting my time, Cade interrupted. You have questions. I have answers, but before we begin... He gestured behind him, toward the heart of the settlement. Walk with me. You need to see what you're dealing with. Vex hesitated. Then, without waiting for permission, Cade turned and walked deeper into the city, and the Union had no choice but to follow. You've seen nothing yet. Nathaniel Cade's voice carried no arrogance, no boast, just a statement of fact. Captain Darius Vex followed, his boots pressing against the reinforced walkway, each step a reminder that this was not just some reckless colony defying Union law. This was an operation, a machine of war disguised as a settlement, a city engineered for endurance. The deeper they walked, the more the reality unraveled. To his right, Ambassador Orlan Trix's jaw was tight, his fingers twitching at his side as his diplomatic aides trailed behind. The Union escorts, armored in combat-resistant plating, shifted uneasily. The air wasn't just oppressive, it was calculated, as if the very environment was watching them, waiting for something unseen. Cade led them past defensive arrays embedded into the rock itself, turrets seamlessly camouflaged within the terrain, motion-sensitive barricades that responded dynamically to even the subtlest changes in pressure. No crude outpost. This was a fortress, alive with controlled destruction. The first real gut punch came when Cade stopped at an open operations bay. What should have been a simple resource distribution center was anything but. The entire structure hummed with subterranean activity. Automated drones carried construction materials, assembling components with an efficiency Vex had only ever seen in military shipyards. Trix exhaled sharply. This is a war factory. Cade didn't correct him. Vex forced himself to stay neutral, but the implications tightened around his throat like a vice. You're manufacturing defensive assets, weapons, large-scale infrastructure, not just for survival. His eyes swept over the command terminals, where human engineers monitored something below the surface, deep beneath the soil. Not just for survival, Cade echoed, nodding. We've adapted. We used what the planet gave us and turned it into an advantage. The subtle weight in his tone made Trix shift uncomfortably. You mean you've weaponized it? Cade's eyes didn't waver. I mean, we've ensured that if anyone tries to take this from us, they will not leave intact. For the first time since landing, Trix hesitated before speaking. Vex took a step closer. Explain. Cade gestured toward the geothermal conduits lining the structure, pipes running deep into the crust, where molten streams surged like veins of a living beast. We harness the seismic activity for power. We use native toxins for biochemical research. And down there, he tilted his head toward the subterranean scanning feeds, we have assets even you can't predict. A sinking sensation coiled in Vex's stomach. He didn't want to ask, but he had to. You've domesticated the wildlife. Cade's lips curled slightly. Domesticated is a strong word. He glanced toward a distant ridge, where a pack of sleek, six-limbed hunters patrolled in formation, each equipped with sensor-linked harnesses, responding to unseen commands. Vex's pulse thrummed. This wasn't a settlement. This was a controlled war zone. Trix stepped forward, forcing his voice into something close to authority. Commander Cade, this facility, this entire operation, it's a direct violation of Union Code. Your people are in unauthorized territory, and this level of militarization... Cade raised a hand, stopping him with a simple look. You still think this is about your laws? A static-laced ping cut through the tension. Cade glanced at the heads-up display on his wrist. His expression shifted, just enough for Vex to notice. Looks like your people have made their first mistake. Vex stiffened. What are you talking about? Cade exhaled, muttering under his breath. You Union types never learn. Without another word, he activated a command sequence. The ground beneath them shifted. A soft, mechanical click echoed from somewhere below. Then, through the display screen mounted on the nearby wall, the underground network came into view. And the Union's covert infiltration team was already failing. The underground tunnels were supposed to be the Union's best option. Stealth units had deployed within the outer perimeters of the settlement, guided by real-time Union surveillance, standard sabotage protocol. Their mission was simple: disable key structural defenses, compromise energy routing systems, force an evacuation. They never got the chance. The first operative dropped, his breath cut short by something that shouldn't have been there. The second managed a stifled warning before something slithered through the dark, and the sound that followed was not one meant for the living. The remaining few scrambled to retreat, but the tunnels were shifting, not collapsing, moving. One by one, they vanished. And then the display feed cut out. Back on the surface, Cade turned toward Vex with a look that was almost bored. You thought you were the first to try that? Trix took a slow, careful breath. Vex clenched his jaw. What did you do? Cade didn't answer immediately. Instead, he signaled something through his command link, and the main doors to the facility opened again. Two surviving Union infiltrators stumbled inside, their weapons gone, their faces drawn tight with something between shock and horror. They were untouched. No blood, no wounds. But their eyes, they had seen something. Cade crossed his arms. Your people just attempted an act of war. He glanced toward Trix. We let them live. That was your one warning. The room fell into complete silence. Trix's mouth opened, then closed. Vex held Cade's stare, searching for any sign of weakness, any hint of negotiation. There was none. What had the Union just walked into? The answer came 12 hours later. The Union High Command didn't waste time. Upon receiving word of the failed infiltration, the sudden loss of communication, and the unsettling reports from the surviving operatives, the response was immediate: a full-scale mobilization directive. Orders came through in clipped, efficient sequences. Captain Vex received his new directive directly from Central Command. Prepare for forced compliance. He closed his eyes. This was spiraling faster than he could contain it. They assumed Cade was bluffing, that this was a rogue colony putting on a show. They hadn't realized this was the opening move to something far worse. Nathaniel Cade watched the Union fleet reposition. He could feel the moment they made their choice. An entire war machine was shifting above them, preparing for occupation protocols, staging to shatter everything they had built. The message had been clear, and now it was time to answer. He reached toward the command relay, tapping a single sequence into the encrypted line. Across the sky, the first wave of planetary defense systems awoke. In Union ships across orbit, command interfaces flashed red. Weapons jammed. Targeting systems scrambled. Comms flooded with interference. On board the Vindicator, Captain Vex stood as his own ship's control panels flickered. The last transmission from the surface cut through the static like a blade to the throat. "You don't understand what we've built here." The entire Union fleet went dark. "But you're about to learn. Deploy now. Secure the ground. Do not, under any circumstances, let this become a siege." Captain Darius Vex's voice cut through the command deck as he stared at the laser plasma display, where the Union fleet descended in coordinated assault waves, their formations like an iron net closing around the Deathworld below. Across orbit, drop bays split open, and warships released their payload, assault craft streaming toward the surface, their thrusters igniting the sky in streaks of fire. Armored divisions followed, mechanized walkers and infantry units configured for planetary warfare. Vex's orders were clear: overwhelm them before they could resist. Yet something gnawed at him. Cade had let them mobilize. Let them walk into this fight, as if it had already been decided. Trix shifted beside him, his face drawn tight. "We should have received an intercept response by now." Vex didn't answer. Then the first anomaly registered. The fleet's communication channels wavered, feeds flickering between active and distorted. Static ruptured command links across deployed units, causing staggered signals between divisions. The pre-planned assault was still underway, but lagging, uneven, disconnected. Below, the planet's terrain began to shift. Union ground forces landed in pre-selected zones, flatlands, coastal regions, and reinforced strongholds meant for quick deployment. The moment they touched down, the land betrayed them. A deep tremor rolled through the terrain, and what had been solid earth a moment ago became a seismic trap. Tactical Officer Valen's voice cracked through the fleet's failing comms. "Sir, our western drop points?" The feed collapsed into static. Then the Union's first casualties fell. They expected resistance. They found the planet itself fighting back. Along the coastline, armored transport carriers touched down on what should have been a stable landing zone, only for the ocean to shift, swirling in unnatural currents. Something rose from the depths, serpentine creatures breaching the surface, their bioluminescent eyes burning through the gloom. Rows of serrated mandibles split open, dragging entire Union walkers into the tides before they could even react. Screams flared through disrupted transmissions. Further inland, mechanized infantry advanced through thick jungle terrain, cutting through dense growth as they pushed toward Cade's stronghold. Their armored legs crushed foliage underfoot, until the foliage pushed back. What had appeared to be passive vegetation suddenly unfurled, releasing clouds of airborne neurotoxins, triggering system malfunctions, and causing targeting visors to flash unreadable errors. The creatures within the jungle stirred. What should have been docile predators, previously seen stalking in the distance, waiting, watching, suddenly moved in orchestrated waves, attacking not at random, but in formation. A trap had been sprung, and the battlefield was no longer theirs. Vex's hands clenched. He watched as his troops faltered, their planned assault spiraling into chaos. Every strategic entry point had been pre-engineered for collapse, forcing the Union's forces into dead zones where they had no cover, no fallback routes. "We need countermeasures," Valen barked, fighting with the controls to re-establish tactical uplinks. Trix's breath was sharp. "This is coordinated. They designed these kill zones before we even landed." Vex already knew. His fleet, his army, hadn't launched an invasion. They had walked into a planetary execution ground, and Cade had been waiting. The 1st Union Mechanized Division collapsed under a directed EMP burst. From beneath the settlement's reinforced underground network, human forces surfaced in waves, striking not in frontal confrontation, but through calculated ambushes. They didn't need traditional firepower. They disabled, redirected, and dismantled. Union walkers buckled, their targeting rerouted before they could return fire. Heavy gunships lost altitude, their engines rerouted into false shutdown commands. The entire battlefield was shifting against them. One of the Union's lead tacticians, embedded within the failing ground forces, attempted to redirect coordination efforts, only to find his command feeds displaying false directives. The words scrolled across his screen in blunt, unshakable finality: "We have control. You have lost it." Cade's voice crackled through the Union fleet's emergency distress bands, cutting through the fractured signals like a knife through exposed armor. "You thought this was an invasion." His tone carried no mockery, only calm inevitability. It was never going to be. On the laser plasma displays, Union warships struggled to realign, their control networks compromised from within. Cade continued, his voice as steady as it had been from the start. "You entered a war that was already over." A beat of silence. Then the first Union capital ship fell from orbit. The first capital ship fell from orbit in silence, its hull ruptured by something unseen, something its defense systems never accounted for. The ship didn't explode in a burst of light, but fractured, broke apart mid-air, as though its own structure had turned against it. Captain Darius Vex watched the catastrophe unfold from the command deck of the Vindicator, his hands tightening on the rail before him. The laser plasma display flickered with damage reports, each red marker another vessel failing, Union ships firing on each other, weapons refusing to lock onto targets, targeting arrays feeding them false coordinates. Vex spun toward Tactical Officer Valen, his voice sharp. "Status report, now." Valen's hands worked across the control interface, his expression darkening. "Sir, we've lost control of our fleet's targeting networks." Trix exhaled sharply beside them, his posture rigid. "That's not possible." Vex's eyes flicked toward the display, where one of the Union dreadnoughts was turning its cannons onto another Union ship, unaware. It fired, and the plasma rounds tore through the unsuspecting warship's midsection, cutting it apart in an instant. Trix swallowed. "It's possible." A Union cruiser panicked, attempting to override its system. Instead, its own defense drones registered friendly vessels as hostiles, and in a horrific, calculated malfunction, they fired point-blank into their own bridge. Cade's voice slipped through the open distress band, clear and unwavering. "You should have left." Vex straightened. "Cade, I gave you a chance, Captain." There was no anger in his tone, no gloating, only certainty. Vex's jaw locked as he took a slow breath. "You've hijacked our ships." "No." Something moved below the surface of the ocean. Vex's gut twisted. The first breach came without warning. Beneath the violent storm front gathering over the southern hemisphere of the Deathworld, a shape rose from the ocean, a massive structure breaking through the black waters. Trix took a step forward in shock. "What the—" The human warship emerged, dripping with salt and steam, its plating reinforced with a material that reflected no scans. A ship that had never existed in Union records. A ship built for this planet alone. Trix's throat tightened. "They had a fleet," Valen cursed under his breath. The hidden warship's railguns ignited, releasing kinetic rounds at high velocity, each strike hitting the weakest points of the Union ships, still struggling to realign. Vex watched as another Union cruiser crumbled, its core reactor destabilized. "This is over," Cade's voice came through again, cold and final. Vex's mind raced. He needed a counterattack, needed something, anything. Then Valen spoke, and his words shattered whatever desperate thought Vex still had. "Sir, it's worse than we thought." His voice was hoarse. "We've been infected." Trix turned, his face paling. "What do you mean?" Valen's hands hovered over the emergency override console, but the inputs were not responding. He pressed again. No effect. Trix leaned closer, his fingers dancing across the data feed. What he saw nearly made him stagger. "Their virus," his voice dropped into something hollow. "It's not in the targeting systems. It's in the ships themselves." Vex turned to him, tension tightening like a coil around his spine. "Explain." Trick swallowed. "We lost the fleet before we fired a single shot." Below, on the Deathworld, seismic charges detonated along the Union's remaining ground forces, rupturing the battlefield with artificial earthquakes. Tectonic plates shifted with unnatural force, swallowing Union outposts whole. Across the landscape, Union soldiers scrambled for retreat, but Predator drones, shaped like the very beasts of this planet, hunted them down in synchronized attacks. Cade stood at the command station deep within the settlement, his gaze fixed on the unfolding destruction above. One of his officers, Garrick Voss, glanced at him from his station. "They're still fighting. What's left of them?" Cade exhaled through his nose. "They haven't accepted it yet." Voss didn't need further orders. He relayed the next phase. The sky cracked open with artificial lightning, an EMP detonation engulfing the remnants of the Union's warships, leaving them adrift, powerless, suspended in their own graveyard. The Union's flagship, Vindicator, shuddered as its reactors flickered. Vex felt the vibration in the floor beneath his boots. He turned to Trix, who stood stone-faced beside him. Trix's voice was barely above a whisper. "We lost." Back on the surface, Cade stepped onto the outer command balcony, watching the Union's fleet burn above the sky, wreckage plummeting in slow arcs through the atmosphere. A small transmission blipped onto his personal console. Vex's voice, fractured but steady. "Negotiation." Cade lifted his gaze toward the drifting wrecks, considering. Then he opened the channel. Vex's image flickered onto the display, standing rigid, his expression carved from stone. Cade didn't wait for pleasantries. "You came here believing you had authority." He let the words settle, the weight of the burning fleet behind him making them undeniable. "That you could dictate terms." Vex's throat worked, but no words followed. Cade continued. "Now you're learning the true cost of believing you rule everything you see." Vex exhaled through his teeth, a slow, measured breath. "What do you want?" Cade's fingers hovered over the console. He could have ended it here, could have severed communication, wiped the remaining fleet from orbit. Instead, he leaned forward. "You will acknowledge this colony as sovereign territory," Cade said. "You will not interfere, you will not return, and you will inform the Union High Command that this world belongs to us." Vex stared. "You demand recognition," he said at last. Cade's lips curled just slightly. "I demand reality." Trix was the one who answered. His voice was heavy. "Understood." Cade inclined his head. "Good." The transmission cut. Garrick Voss exhaled beside him, watching as the Union survivors retreated, their broken fleet limping toward deep space. "They'll come back," Voss muttered. Cade turned, watching the sky shift back into quiet. Not for a long time. Far above, in the ruins of what was once an unstoppable invasion force, the Union ships that still had functioning drives ignited their course back toward Union-controlled space. On board the Vindicator, Vex stood silent, watching the Deathworld shrink behind them. Trix stood beside him, arms crossed. He spoke after a long silence. "This will change everything." Vex didn't answer. "Confirm withdrawal sequence." Captain Darius Vex's voice barely carried over the fractured command deck. The Vindicator was limping through the edge of the system, its integrity failing, its fleet reduced to a scattering of crippled warships struggling to escape the gravity well of their own destruction. Union ships were still drifting where they had lost control, some barely responding, others reduced to dead husks, abandoned in the void. Vex gripped the console as the laser plasma display flickered, cycling through damage reports that no longer mattered. The war was over. Trix was standing behind him, silent, watching as the planet shrank in their rear view, its surface still pulsing with hostile life and hidden artillery systems, waiting for any sign of return. "They let us go." His voice was controlled, but the weight beneath it was undeniable. Vex didn't look away from the display. Trix continued, his words sharper now. "They had every chance to finish us. They didn't." A flicker of movement in the distance. one of Cade's warships breaking from the planet's atmosphere, settling into a geosynchronous orbit, not as a pursuer, but as a reminder. Vex exhaled through his nose. They didn't need to. Trix took a step closer. Because they already won. Cade watched from the command station as the last Union ships blinked into faster-than-light retreat, their fractured remnants fleeing into territory that no longer belonged to them. Garrick Voss leaned against the console, arms folded. They'll spread the message before they even reach Union space. They don't have a choice, Cade replied. Voss exhaled, gaze flicking toward the heads-up display, mapping the trajectories of the retreating vessels. You think they'll come back? Cade tilted his head, considering. Not soon. Not willingly. The silence that followed was thicker than the aftermath of battle, not relief, not triumph. A new equilibrium settling into place. A low confirmation tone chimed from the main console. Secure status update. All automated defenses were back online, operational fortifications reinforced, sensor networks recalibrated. No gaps, no vulnerabilities. They were untouchable. Voss exhaled through his nose. I suppose that makes it official. Cade turned toward him. Say it. Voss met his gaze. This planet belongs to us now. Cade nodded once. And if they ever come back. Voss's lips quirked into something that wasn't quite a smile. We won't be this merciful. Word spread before the Union fleet even returned home. The communications blackout had lifted, and in its place, 1,000 scattered messages burned across diplomatic channels, leaked transmissions, classified reports that no longer mattered because the entire galactic order had just been rewritten. The Union had been forced to retreat, not negotiated, not restructured, defeated. The council chambers on the Union homeworld fell into chaos. Leaders argued behind closed doors, military strategists demanded explanations, entire sectors braced for whatever consequences would follow. But there was only one truth now. A species had taken what should have been uninhabitable and made it a stronghold. A species had outmaneuvered, outgunned, and outlasted the most powerful fleet in the galaxy. A species had weaponized a Deathworld. And the galaxy could no longer pretend humanity was anything less than a force that could never be contained again. Nathaniel Cade stood at the edge of the settlement, watching as storm fronts churned in the distance, their energy crackling across the ridgelines, feeding into the power grids woven into the ground itself. The planet still lived beneath them, still violent and unpredictable, but it was theirs. Footsteps approached from behind. Alden Rhine, the chief engineer, stopped beside him, gaze flicking toward the horizon where the last Union wrecks were still smoldering in the atmosphere. I ran projections, Rhine said. Other factions will hear about this soon. We'll have diplomats showing up in months, traitors within a year. There'll be consequences. Cade's fingers twitched at his side, but his voice was steady. We don't need alliances, he said. We don't need diplomacy. Rhine smirked. Number, but they'll offer it anyway. Cade tilted his head. Because they know what happens if they don't. A long silence. Then Rhine shook his head with something close to amusement. They came expecting to find survivors. Cade watched as the storm rolled closer, the ground pulsing with the heartbeat of something too large to be measured in any metric the Union had ever known. They found something else,